Hey there, Wild Mamas and friends. Welcome back to Wild Mama TV. I'm Tiff, and today we're going into part 3 of my 4-part series around how I joined a cult at 16 years old, had an arranged marriage by 20 years old, and then became a mama at 22, and everything that happened after that. So this is a traumatic experience that I had in my life, and it was really difficult to experience, but it is one experience that I am very, very grateful to say that I have healed from, which is why I waited 11 years to even tell this story, because I wanted to be in a place where I could share from a healed place, a place of love and joy, and not a place of resentment or anger, etc. Because I feel like in the end, that doesn't really help anybody. So I'm very, very, very happy to be sharing this story with y'all. And I want to just say thank you to everybody who's engaged with me online, watching my videos, sharing my videos, engaging with me in the comments, on Facebook, on Instagram, all of the places, sending me private messages and public messages. So I just want to say thank you for supporting me, but also thank you for engaging in deeper conversation and reflection with yourselves and with your family, because I think that this is an experience that isn't often talked about. It's very taboo, and especially you don't often hear of a black, brown, mixed woman like myself talking about joining a cult. So I do think it's an important story to share, and I'm very glad that I'm in a place to be able to share it. So thank you for receiving my offering, and thank you for tuning in. So today, I just want to dig deeper into what happened after I realized that I had been spiritually raped by this church, and what happened when I left. And particularly, I'm going to be going into the topics around death, divorce, depression, and discovery. So if you'd like to tune in and hear more about this story and what happened after I left, then stay tuned and definitely keep on watching. All right, welcome back, y'all. Let's get started. So where I left you off in part 2 is that I realized that after 6 or 7 years of being in this church, that I had been spiritually raped. Now, I don't use that term lightly, because I understand that that word can be quite triggering, but I want y'all to understand the severity of what happened to me. I described it a little bit in the last video, but for me, what was done and what happened was the taking, the ripping out of my essence, separating me from myself, taking something from me that at 16, even 20 years old, I could not consent to giving away. And what's crazy, what's really fucked up about this spiritual rape is that it didn't just end with the spiritual, with the things you can't see. It resulted in me getting pregnant at 22, because didn't nobody want to tell me about birth control, right? Or educate me on sex. Yes, I could have done some research, figured it out, but when you're brainwashed and when you're in a church that you get praised for following along and being a robot and doing what everybody tells you to do, I was just looking for answers from somebody else. And that's part of the control and the brainwashing, the tactics of this church, is that the more you get disconnected from yourself, the more that you can be controlled, the more that you buy into the system, and the more you give to that system. The spiritual manipulation and rape that happened to me caused me to be fully disconnected from myself, so much so that I ended up having an arranged marriage, had a baby, and then I left you in the last video that I had just found out that I was pregnant again. Right when I woke up, realized I was spiritually raped, and then decided to leave. So it's a big deal what happened. And again, I don't use that term lightly. But this was not a light situation. This wasn't a game. This was my life. And at a very vulnerable age, I had been taken advantage of. And some people have asked me, like, over like phone, chat, DM, whatever, like, why did they do this? Why would they do this? Like, what benefit do they get out of doing this? And obviously I can't speak for other people, but I know that the people who taught me genuinely believed that what they were teaching was right, because that's what was taught to them. Because the way that this church works is you come in when you're about 18 and 19, maybe 20 years old, right? Like, the younger the better, because you're very, very impressionable at that age. You have to understand that I was 16 when I came. 16 turning 17. I did not know much, and even though I had that many years of life, in just 3 or 4 years of being in that church, my entire world, my entire perspective, and how I oriented myself in the world, saw myself in the world, and interacted with the people around me, completely changed. Everything was changed, and that's the power of brainwashing. And that's why I want you to understand how serious this is, because it's not simply brainwashing or manipulation or emotional abuse. It's spiritual. And you got to understand that when someone is attacked on a spiritual level, when someone is drawn in on a spiritual level, when someone is manipulated on a spiritual level, that shit runs deep, because we are spiritual beings. We all have a soul, right? Like, we're all energy. We all exist outside of these bodies. And the gravity of what happens to us when something like that is tainted, destroyed, taken away, abused, manipulated, all of the things, it is traumatizing. And especially when you're so young and you really cannot give consent to something like that. I don't believe I could have given like real consent to getting married at 20 years old, or the shit that happened to me between 16 and 20. How do you give consent to something like that? Like, for real. You can't. So I was at this point where I was feeling like totally defeated and like a victim. And you have to understand that I was already feeling bad when I joined, right? Like, and I shared in the last video that I thought by joining I was doing something right. Like, when do you think going to a church is going to fuck up your life? Like, that's not generally what you think. Like, yeah, we might all have varying degrees of spiritual belief and desire or whatnot, but the picture that is painted around church, etc., generally the norm is that it's a safe place. You can go there, you can know Jesus, you can sing, whatever. That was the innocence to which I came to Bible study, in which I went to that first conference, and then when I started going to that church. I did not have a clue. I couldn't have had a clue that anyone in their right mind would ever put a young person like me in that kind of position. But that's what happened. But I genuinely believe that the people that taught me believed that they were right, because most of them all came when they were a little older than me, in college, some in high school, some were born in the church, but they all learned all of that from the original spiritual leader that was there. And I cannot say what his ultimate motivations were, because I didn't actually meet him and I don't know him. But I know that in a lot of cases, it's about ego, it's about power, it's about control. So by bringing someone like me in, and not only getting me to like fully commit to the church, but also get married and have a baby, there's more opportunity to control. And when you get married in that church and when you have babies in that church, that church, that those people, they're your community. They're all you know, and they're what you surround yourself around all the time. So the thought of leaving, especially after having a baby and all those things, it is difficult. It's very, very challenging to leave, especially when all the messages that you're given around leaving is that if you leave, you lack faith in God. If you leave, you're a sinner. If you leave, it's because you have alternative motives, or you want to engage with, like, I don't know, evil shit, like whatever it is, that whatever they say. So anyways, I just want you to know that that's where I was at, and it was very difficult, and I was starting to feel like a victim, because I was feeling like no matter how hard I work, no matter how strong my dreams are, no matter how much I wanted to live into my fullest potential in this life, I could not. It felt like I kept getting beat down over and over and over again, that I would come up for air and finally feel like I'm going to rise above, and I would get beat down. I would just get knocked down over and over and over again. My life was fucking hard. And I went to this church, like I shared in the last video, thinking that it was going to help me solve my problems, right? Help me heal, help me figure it out. And it only made it worse. Like, it made it like 50 million times worse. And I left the church not just being spiritually raped and having to deal with that, but also with a baby, another baby on the way, a husband, and a family that I needed to figure out how to reconcile with, friends I hadn't seen who I need to try to reconcile with, learn to figure out who I am and what my identity is. What do I even believe? Because everything that I thought was true is now up for debate. Everything is put into question. And so when you leave a church like that, the church does not leave you right away. All those beliefs, all that brainwashing, all that conditioning doesn't just leave right away. This is why people in abusive relationships tend to go back. Because as fucked up as it might be, we only believe what we've been taught to believe. It's very difficult to see outside of the world and the picture that has been, crafted very intentionally for you. So that's the experience that I was navigating. And so I was also trying to, finally finish college after being there for 6 years, while also now knowing that I'm pregnant and going to have my second child in, just 8-9 months from the time that I woke up. So imagine all of that. And so it's like, I don't know how, y'all, but even after all of that, I still believed that I could figure my life out. And I do believe that writing my ideal day really helped me hold true to something bigger than myself that was so far off from my current reality. But I do believe that having that vision and that picture in my head really did drive me and help me move past my, current circumstances. So as I kind of moved forward and tried to navigate this world after this other world that I was now in, I luckily finally graduated from college, which, even though it took me 6 years, I was still the first in my family to graduate from college. So I'm very proud of myself for that. And I think after leaving the church, even though there was a lot I didn't understand, I did have a deeper motivation to figure some shit out and change my life. But it was very, very difficult and very, very hard. But I just tried to focus on my daughter, my family, and graduating college, because I needed to graduate before I had my son. So I did thankfully graduate and had my son, and thought that life was getting better, and that maybe everything is gonna be okay. But then my mom went into surgery for the second time for a lung transplant in January. So my son was born in November. 2 months later, my mom went back into the hospital for a lung transplant. So she had had a lung transplant for a year, during kind of my transition out of the church. But then after a year, her body started to reject the lung. And so she was brought in for a second lung transplant. And unfortunately, she did not wake up from the anesthesia. So I didn't realize that when you go into a second surgery like that, when you go into a second transplant, that the risks of you making it are way lower. Like the risk of something happening are way, way higher. And I was still just like navigating a lot. And so I didn't go to the hospital before her surgery, because I was taking care of my sister who had traumatic brain injury, and I was at the house, and I just felt like, she'll be fine. She's gonna go in the surgery. It's gonna be like the first time. She'll be back, and like everything's gonna be fine. But unfortunately, it didn't work out like that. So literally 2 months to the day that my son was born, my mom passed away on January 26, 2010. So I was already dealing with the shame that I felt of even joining that church, because I felt like, my God, Tiff, like, how could you be so dumb? Like, this is how I used to think. How could you be so dumb? How could you let those people do that? Like, why would you go to that church? Like, all of the things, right? All the shame, blaming myself for what had happened. But also because of the church and what I had been taught to believe, I shared in, one of the other videos that, I was separating myself from my family, not because I didn't want to be around my family, but because that's what I was fucking taught. So imagine, after all of these years being in this church, kind of being distant from your family, and then coming out, slowly waking up, realizing the gravity of what happened, being spiritually raped, having 2 children, having a husband, trying to graduate from college, and then literally like just months after finally making that decision, you lose your mom. Like after 9 years of her being sick. There is no way to ever fully reconcile that relationship. So again, I tell you that it didn't just end when I left the church. I had to then navigate everything that came after. There were consequences to those decisions, even though those decisions were made from a non-consensual place, from being brainwashed, and genuinely thinking that I was pleasing God and that this is what God wanted. But it wasn't, and it was fucked up, and I lost my mom. So no one's to blame for my mom dying or when she died, but the timing of things just made it so hard. So I was 24, going on 25. I was 24 when she passed. And I just graduated from college. I had 2 kids, and one of my greatest fears for so long was my mom dying. And not only my mom dying, but that if she died, I would likely have to take care of my sister, who had traumatic brain injury, who also had a daughter. And that's exactly what happened. Like, I literally went into survival mode right after my mom died. And then I had to become the legal guardian of my sister. And at the time, I was living in a garden unit apartment. It was like a very small 2-bedroom with my 2 kids and my husband at the time. And we literally like moved my sister out of my mom's house with her daughter, and they both moved into my place, which was tiny. And I won't go into it too much, but I was already kind of getting burnt out from caretaking from everybody else. But having to then live with someone with traumatic brain injury, when I'm not an expert at mental health, I'm not an expert at traumatic brain injury and what all of that entails, it was just a lot for me to deal with while also trying to mourn the loss of my mother. So I would say that at that time I didn't really mourn the loss of my mother fully, and it wasn't till like a year later, when I went to Mexico for 2.5 months, that I was really able to kind of grieve and mourn. But I went into survival mode because I had to figure this out. I had to take care of my sister, and I had to make sure that my mom was buried or cremated, whatever it was gonna be, that happened. I wanted to celebrate her life. So yeah, I figured all of that out. But it was a loss that I knew was coming, but I was afraid of what's gonna happen. And it did. And so after I started taking care of my sister, I got really burnt out, and I really couldn't do it anymore. So after a while, I was able to get her dad to become her legal guardian, and then me and Ruben and the kids left to Mexico, because I was desperate to get out, and I was desperate to like find another way, figure some shit out, and navigate this life. But you add trauma after trauma after trauma, pain, confusion, all of the things like constantly on top of each other. It's unbearable. Like it's literally unbearable. And yet still I had some hope, and I went to Mexico and I learned Spanish in Guanajuato, and trying to figure it out. But then when we were in Mexico, it became very clear. Like, this is 2 years after leaving the church. By the time we get to Mexico, it was around like when I was 25. When we got to Mexico, that's when it became so utterly clear that while we had married in the church, and within that context it all made sense, outside of the church, our marriage, Ruben and I's relationship, did not make sense. And we were friends, we cared about each other. He's the one person in my life, the one man in my life that will have ever met my mother. But us in a relationship wasn't right. It didn't make sense outside of the context of the church. And so after 2 years of navigating those waters, and then ending up in Mexico, that's when we decided that we would separate. So I left the church. I already had a baby, a husband, then graduated somehow, then had my second baby, then my mother died, and then not too long after that, we're gonna get a divorce. So yeah. So yeah, I think I was still in survival mode, not fully feeling the pain and agony of all of these things and all of this change and all of this transition happening in my life. I was just trying to make it each day, and trying to maintain some kind of hope throughout, because I had to believe that there was some reason why all of this shit was happening. And I just had a deep, deep burning desire within myself to realize my fullest potential in my life. That's literally like all I wanted. I just had these burning desires and visions in myself. And even though all of my life circumstances did not match up, I still wanted those things to actualize in my life. Like, that's all I wanted. I wanted to be happy, and I wanted to be in joy, and I wanted to be able to give what I had to give in this life. And I guess I refused to be totally beaten down by all of these life circumstances that were all out of my control for the most part. So death, then divorce, and after the divorce, I became a single mama. Not for long, but I still became a single mama. And I was about 26 years old by this time. And trying to make up for years of not like living my youth, like not having a like young adulthood. And that was something I really started to struggle with, especially after the divorce, was how is it that I'm a mom? Like, I love my kids. I absolutely love my kids. But how am I a mom? And how do I reconcile being a mom and also wanting to live like my life and have experiences and do things that I want to do things that you do when you're 26, 27, 28, 23 years old. Like, I was resentful of the church that they took that away from me by having me have this arranged marriage. It was very difficult to reconcile those things. So I really struggled with my motherhood identity for a long, long time. But I was so, it was so difficult to navigate the waters of leaving the church, that not only leaving the church, but then my mom dying and then divorcing, I was not able to live with my kids for like 2 years. And they were taken care of by their dad and their grandparents. And so when I tell you that after the church, I had to deal with all of these different repercussions from what happened, like, it wasn't just losing my mom, it wasn't just getting divorced, it was also that I wasn't able to be the mother that I wanted to be, because I just couldn't. And for years I had a lot of guilt around that, but I literally could not take care of my kids. I had them every other weekend, I saw them all the time, but I couldn't live with them, I couldn't provide for them, because I couldn't even provide for myself. I just lacked a lot of skills. So after all of that and years go by, I start to kind of like fall into this despair and depression, that resulted in me, like, again, going back to just like watching television and like binge watching television. And by this time Netflix was out, by this time Hulu was out, TiVo, all of these things, by this time all of these kind of streaming services were out. So I literally would just binge watch on my computer all of these different shows to try to cope. Yeah. I was really, really lost. And honestly, it's hard to explain because there was just a lot of, I mean, that's a lot of years, right? So it was like 6 years after leaving, all of these things happened, and I was navigating all of these waters in survival mode, trying to figure it out, not sure what to do, and just really, really confused. And I had a deep, deep level of self-hatred, shame, guilt, and I was pissed. I was pissed at what happened. I was pissed at my decision. I regretted it all at that time, and it felt really lonely, and I wasn't sure if I was gonna make it through. So yeah, this was kind of like a depressing, melancholic part 3, but it was the reality of my life and my experience. And again, it's so nuanced, and there's so many things that I could share, but I'm not sharing because it's hard to explain. But I'm sharing as much as I can so that you can understand the journey, right? Like, this is a long, long journey over time, to not only be in that situation, but then to recover from that situation. So I'm going to stop here. I think that's enough for today. I talked about death, I talked about divorce, depression, and actually I didn't really get to discovery because we just are already at time. So I'll continue that in part 4, because the light does come in the end, which is why I'm standing here today. But I hope you are gaining some valuable understanding around, this situation, the healing process, and also insight into my journey of not only joining the cult, but then leaving and dealing with the aftermath. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining. I wish y'all love and joy and healing, and especially for all my wild mamas navigating a lot of change and transition in your lives. I just want you to know that you are loved, and I hope hearing this story helps you see that you're not the only one navigating difficulties while also being a mother. So thank you guys for tuning in to this part. Again, watch part 1 and part 2 if you haven't already. But I'll see you in the next video in part 4. Bye, y'all.